Today on Great Chat, we're talking about commencement speeches. In the wake of Eric Schmidt's disastrous AI pitch at the University of Arizona, we break down what went wrong and walk through some of the great counterexamples from recent decades. More broadly, has the art of speech writing been lost in this age of clipping? I'm Helen, and this week, it's me and Ashley. Great Chat is brought to you by Mercury, radically different banking loved by over 300,000 entrepreneurs. We use Mercury to run this podcast and love recommending it to other founders and fund managers. It's free to get started. Try it for yourself. Visit mercury.com to learn more and apply online in minutes.
Hey.
Hi.
Just the two of us this week. How cozy.
Just the two of us reminds me that, do you see the SNL cold open?
I did not, but now I have the Just the Two of Us song in my head. Is that related?
It involves that, yes. It ends with Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump singing that. So I've had that stuck in my head for a couple of days. So it's funny you said that.
I'm such a millennial. My brain goes to Dr. Evil and Mini-Me
100%.
doing
Absolutely.
the two of us in Austin Powers. I apologize to our Gen Z listeners who might not get that reference.
Oh, man. If you ever look me up on Quora, I do answer a series of questions about Austin Powers. A fun fact about me.
Really?
I'm slightly obsessed with the Austin Powers series. Anyways, moving on.
Wait, me too. I was Ivana Hump a lot for Halloween one year at Box. Extended into my 20s, which, very corporate appropriate Halloween costume. And that just really is a sign of the times when it was sort of anything goes in that startup era. Okay, bringing it back to the present day. We're recording this on Tuesday, which means yesterday we got the verdict for the Musk versus Altman OpenAI trial. And it's funny, it was the most boring possible conclusion, but I kind of felt like it would be. I don't know. I don't know. How are you feeling? I didn't think oh my gosh, this is the beginning of the end for OpenAI. I mean, the stakes were really high, but it just felt kind of impossible that Elon was going to win.
It did not seem impossible he was going to win. He's had so many at-bats, going to trial, filing lawsuits, losing, but winning. And, losing, you also learn a ton of things too, right? And this was very new for Sam and the OpenAI team, which is a pretty new team. And so I actually don't think that it was a foregone conclusion. And the reason why people were sort of on the edge of their seats is because they really didn't know which way it was going to go. But my husband is a litigator, and I was like, this was the outcome. And he's like, ha. And I'm like, what? Do you think that was the strategy? And he's like, yeah, that was probably the strategy, because you just go for the least muddy, least messy path. And so if the OpenAI team decided that is the most black and white clear case, right, that's what they're going to go for. Now, the reason why, as people who did not go to the trial, right, and watch it, but followed it, on Twitter, we were surprised, is because that strategy is boring, like you said, and it's never covered. All the little this and that and the story arc and the characters, right, that got covered to death. So we started obsessing about those things and the drama. And so this sort of felt like a surprise, right? But I think it seems like it was pretty intentional and deliberate on OpenAI's part. So good for them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, great. I actually saw some commentary that OpenAI should have brought that up earlier, because the judge wouldn't rule on the statute of limitations unless it was brought up by the defense. I don't understand the legal procedures enough to know if that's an accurate internet hot take. Talking to some friends who are lawyers, they thought that Musk's legal representation was terrible. And I was like, why? He's one of the richest, if not the richest man in the world. And it's just lawyers hate working with him because he's so unpredictable. He's so challenging. He's so antagonistic. So the people that who in my mind are more expert than I am didn't think he had a chance. And a lot of it was because the way that they tried to build their case. It's funny. It almost feels like this entire thing was designed for maximum entertainment with minimum impact, because we of course did get all of the Sam Altman and Mira text dumps. And we now know that Greg Brockman and Ilya have like 30 billion and 7 billion worth of OpenAI equity.
Lots of
And
money. Yeah.
it's kind of like no one won. I mean, definitely like OpenAI avoided disaster, but it almost felt like in some ways like a continuation of the New Yorker profile and a lot of the dirty laundry
Right.
around OpenAI being aired.
Well, that's why people settle, right?
Sure, and I also wonder if like that was part of Elon's gamble.
I
Like,
mean, he texted Greg Brockman, right? Like days before the trial saying,
yeah,
you have a chance to settle this or else, you two will be the most hated men in America or something like that. He said something like that, right? And so that I think
yeah,
probably that supports what you're saying. But yeah, I think that's why people often do settle, even if they have a clear cut case. They just like don't want to be on the stand
totally.
or like all that evidence to be released.
I also feel like these moments are basically like the Super Bowl for the reporters who cover them. Like Mike
It
Isaac,
seemed like, oh, it seemed like it. Nobody was enjoying this more than him. Yeah.
totally. Although I started listening to his daily episode yesterday where he was talking about the trial, but pre-verdict. And then while I was listening, the verdict came out. So I kind of lost interest because I was like, well, now I know how this story ends.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he was saying he was like up at 5 every morning. I mean, it is like a super taxing,
Right.
maybe like Olympics or something that is continuous is a better sports metaphor. That is always fun. And I like it made me think back to prior, like the Elizabeth Holmes trial and how Twitter and like it's a moment where actually journalists really shine on Twitter, which is, less common these days because they are the ones reporting out and then
Oh,
the rest of
right.
the internet gets to react. So speaking of Twitter, Helen, how real is that DD post that has gone super viral about how
Oh
like
my gosh. So
depressed everyone in San Francisco is?
let me tell you about how my weekend went. I am like in a number of group chats, including our own, where the post comes up, and I was super dismissive of it. I was like, I feel
Yeah.
bad for this person, and this is dumb. And various people who I love and respect in many cases were just like, I think that's super real, and I'm miserable as a result, like identifying with one of like the archetypes that he laid out. And I was like, oh shit, was that insensitive of me? And so I feel like I've been like pulling back a little bit on my thoughts on this one because it definitely resonates. Like that's
Maybe we should summarize for people who aren't extremely online.
yeah.
This guy
Also,
posted
with
about
with a caveat that like it is speaking to a Twitter crowd. I think that this is not something that was meant to be broad consumption.
yeah, Twitter crowd slash like Silicon Valley
Yeah.
like elite. But the general gist is that there are a lot of people in San Francisco and Silicon Valley who have quite a bit of anxiety around not hitting a certain like escape velocity given the wild distribution of wealth in the tech ecosystem right now. So he references how like maybe just a quote over the past 5 years, a group of 10,000 people who are employees at OpenAI, Anthropic, XAI, et cetera, have hit retirement wealth of well over 20 million, and that like everyone else is like struggling with their sub 500K salaries and like can't see
Oh,
the path. And just sort of the, it sort of ties into the sort of narrative around the permanent underclass. And I think there really is, there does seem to be like a feeling that if you don't make it in the next couple of years, you've sort of like missed your window. The funny thing is, this is not a new dynamic. It's just a more extreme version of a story that we've heard before, extreme in terms of like the levels of wealth and extreme in terms of the speed. But like I've always been fascinated by how the seemingly random distribution of success impacts certain people, and that's always been part of the challenge of living and working in the startup ecosystem. If you hold yourself in comparison to other people, you're always going to have examples of like the peer you like came up with or maybe who reported to you like
oh yeah.
vastly outpacing you. And I've always been, I actually had like a novel I was going to write that was like about this, like following three friends over the course of their careers and like how that changes the sort of relational dynamics, how people feel about themselves. Because I do think it is fascinating and it is a very unique environment to be part of. And so to me, this just feels like this is a really extreme version. And it's also the thing that feels new is that status in tech is more tied to wealth than it was before. Like I mean, it was cool to be part of a company that like went public for sure, but it did not feel like wealth was the metric. Wealth was sort of the output or the sort of byproduct of other types of success, other types of status. And now everything just feels much more measurable. And it also reflects the way we talk about companies. It's all, path to 100 million ARR. What's your latest valuation? And that feels like it's seeped down on an individual level as well in a way that like I honestly cannot relate as I'm a very online person, but I live in New York and I do not feel this I do not feel this in the New York tech community at all, which I think is kind of fascinating.
The reason why I sort of like pushed that aside was this weekend was beautiful in San Francisco. It was like stunning and sunny. And when I moved to San Francisco, I moved here from Chicago. I was dirt
Mm.
poor, like making less
Yeah.
than $30,000 a year. And I was so happy because San Francisco is such a beautiful city. And for being in California, it actually has really great public transportation. I didn't have a car, but I like could get everywhere. And it was just sort of like I was super happy when I had nothing and I got to enjoy all the gifts of the city and like especially growing up in the East Coast and Midwest, like appreciating the weather and like all of these things, right? So to me, I think I've always one difference that I've felt like growing up in tech, after leaving advertising and joining tech, where I was like, oh, people grew up, for the most part, pretty privileged, like everyone went to good schools. I just kind of felt like what made me a little bit different was sort of like I know what it feels like to have nothing. I know what it feels like to go to a state university and like have certain, ideas of what my future would look like successful, but not like, I'm going to be on the cover of Time magazine. Like it was just sort of like a different thing. And
Helen, I believe in you. One day your time will come.
yes, because yes, magazine covers and me.
You have a face for time.
But like my point is sort of like I feel super lucky, right? To for everything that I have. And I think that that's what a lot of people's were saying as commentary, where it's just like what you were saying about like your peer group, just keep comparing, right? No matter how successful you get, you just you keep comparing,
Yeah.
and that can make you miserable. And even people who are, who have made it, if you're in part of that 10,000 person group, oh, there's definitely segmentation and misery, right, within that group as well. And I think that because San Francisco like isn't a very big city, like it's the groups can be smaller. It's like the people you are in preschool with or schools and like different organizations and clubs or whatever, like it's easier for you to have like a peer set that you start comparing yourself to. And it truly is, that quote, the thief comparison is the thief of joy. Like I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
comparison and it's really hard, especially if you have gone to all the right schools, have worked really hard and, worked at all the right places and still you're not among the top whatever, right? I'm sure that can feel very, very frustrating and unfair. But, I'm very like life is not fair. And I think I was probably insensitive about that in some chats, but that's how I feel.
What
Like,
you were
whoops.
alluding to is like the sort of baseline you set is really important. So like
Mm,
people talk about happiness being reality minus expectations, but a lot of us have very like high expectations or ambitions for life. And so the thing that I found most useful is very intentionally picking my like what am I comparing myself to? Am I comparing myself to like me from 3 months ago or my friend who's super smart and accomplished? Or am I like thinking about, to your point, like when you first moved to San Francisco and started working, like you would be blown away by all you've gotten to experience and be part of over the
totally.
course of your career. So,
I think you and I also have this other benefit, which is that we were part of previous generations of wealth creation, right? And so we can kind of fast forward and see a nice sample size of what happens to those people. And, after Facebook went public, that was life changing for, I think, several thousands of people in San Francisco, many more in the larger Bay Area, of course. I'm friends with a lot of those people. And yeah, some of them are super happy and some of them are not. And it's just sort of
yeah,
there's a sample set where you see variance, if that makes sense, right? And like however you want to feel, there's going to be data to support however you want to feel. So decide to feel good. It's kind of like how I think
I
about it.
thought you were going to say we have the benefit of having been in like lower status roles. Like marketing and PR, especially during the era that we came up in, were not like now, like storytelling is super hot. And you're like, if you're a good storyteller, you're like at an A16Z new media retreat the last weekend, being wined and dined. That was like not the reality, at least for me during my like 6 years at Box. I had no opportunity to develop like a big ego around my status within tech. And I think that's really helpful. Like I think it was humbling to be like, okay, there's not going to be like a ton of external validation for this role, but I
Oh,
actually
right.
like see how it's
Yes.
really important and get value from that, like derive my value from like that impact versus do people think I'm cool? And I mean, you worked at Facebook, so you had that going for you, but I was like enterprise software PR. I think that start was helpful. And especially now, we've talked about this before, being a VC and especially having an emerging fund is like lower status than it used to be.
Totally.
This is where I'm comfortable. I don't need a high status job. I like measure things on different dimensions. So anyways, none of this is to preach to anyone because I do think the feelings can be very real. And to your
Right.
point, I think if you're in some of these communities where everyone feels this way, it's very hard to extract yourself from that. But I think it was both fascinating how deeply people identified with this tweet and then also interesting to see like the pushback. And I think this does sort of represent a broader struggle that's happening right now in sort of the tech elite. Also, really interesting juxtaposition with the sort of meta layoffs, which are a story that continues to unfold.
I feel like we had different opinions about the whole like leak a month ago, where they announced that on May 20th they would be letting go of 8,000 people or whatever the final number was. And I thought, oh, maybe that's smart that they got ahead of it, whatever. But now I'm kind of like, oh, like it just really feels like the prolonging the drama and anticipation. And
I feel like Meta's hand was forced because it did like
it was
properly
a
leak.
leak.
And then it took them a couple weeks to confirm the leak. And I imagine they probably had to do that because there was so much internal pressure
Right.
to
Right.
weigh in on this news report. And so, like a month ago, they were like, yes, we are going to do these layoffs, but we're not going to do them until May 20th because they were like still figuring out like who was going to be part of them, which is crazy. It's an interesting look. I feel like you don't normally get like such a big window. And also, I feel like people are just grieving more openly these days because maybe because there's less stigma with being laid off when like everyone's being laid off everywhere. Emily Dreyfus in the San Francisco Standard had an anonymous interview with an employee who had been at Meta for 10 plus years and was like wondering if she's going to get laid off. And like she's just talking about like the openly doomsday vibes. People are feeling extra pressure to maintain or grow their place on these like AI leaderboards. So they're just like finding ways to use tokens in case that's a filter. The most interesting thing from this piece was the woman who was interviewed referenced an internal post from an employee where they said something like employees they're being made to do work to replace themselves with AI, right? So like training the AI to do their jobs. There should be like a different kind of severance. But it is an interesting question of like, is the classic like severance, and I think companies are being very generous with severance these days because they know how hard the job market is. And they're generally doing these from like a position of relative strength, right? They're not about to go out of business when they're doing these layoffs. But like, is the classic severance enough? Is there like a broader conversation we need to have around like, yeah, if employees' jobs are to train AI to take their jobs away, should they be compensated differently? Should there be like retraining as part of these layoffs? Like I think we're in this first wave where we're kind of mimicking the traditional norms, but maybe we're going to see some sort of like future state of how layoffs are conducted, especially as, it's companies, again, like doing this from a relative position of strength.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about having your severance tied to how your direct involvement in training your AI replacement that benefits the company in the long term. It gives whole new meaning to like lasting impact, right? Like as an employee.
It's almost like royalties, right? Like royalties for knowledge work.
Right.
Because the
Yeah.
AI
No,
you
I
trained is continuing to use your workflows, your institutional knowledge, et cetera.
That's really interesting. I think that that might actually create a new framework for how we value just general work work in
Yeah.
general with no one being replaced by anything. But yeah, that will be I'm sure that will be hit hard this week and it will be weird and I think one of the sadder things about it is like companies will follow, right? And I think that's a reality.
Yeah, it's like we saw this with Elon when he took over Twitter however many years ago and like axed a bunch of people and it gave a lot of other people permission to like cut bloated workforces. And this is just that
Right.
on a much, much bigger scale.
Right.
And so, yeah, it'll be interesting and stressful to watch. I think the other fascinating thing is like, I find it very easy to have empathy for people in these situations, but I feel like probably the general public does not feel too bad for the Meta
Right.
employee who's worked there for 10
Yeah.
years and making like very healthy six figures, probably has an amazing equity package. And so once again, there's this like distortion of perception between, inside of tech and outside, which maybe is a good tee up for there's a new New York Times Siena poll. I think because I wrote about like tech's doomsday AI narrative. People just tag me in this stuff now. And honestly, it's so helpful. Like anytime there's anything around like negative public sentiment around AI, I'm like, oh, I've like trained Twitter to send me stuff. But this one was interesting. It basically showed perception around AI by both like political affiliation, but then also age group. The sort of most relevant stat for our broader conversation today is that it is the 18 to 29 group, which was the youngest group polled, that is the most negative about AI. So 47% of that cohort think that AI is mostly bad. I mean, it's funny. It was like compared to like something in like the 20s or whatever for much older people. And I'm like, I just don't think the older people are paying attention. So I don't know if it's so much that like grandma's like loving AI, although maybe she is. But yeah, the negative sentiment around AI, which I think like flows us perfectly into, we want to talk a little bit about Eric Schmidt's commencement speech
Yes.
and the reception there.
Yes, Eric Schmidt's commencement speech also made the rounds on Twitter and various group chats. And I think, generally speaking, although I saw a couple of very strange in defense of Eric Schmidt's graduation speech, for the most part, people were like, that did not land. It was a little tone deaf. And so, if you haven't got it, basically, he gave the commencement speech at University of Arizona, and he got booed. And I think two important pieces of context. One, there was already like a petition circulating, or there was already sort of like people
Yeah.
kind of not being stoked that he was chosen as the speaker because he's got like a civil suit against him by like a former girlfriend right now or something.
Oh, he's got a lot of interesting skeletons in
Yeah.
his closet.
Yeah. So I guess the audience was primed, right? And then, the way that he talked about AI, and this is what we're going to talk about, which is like comparing it to other times technology leaders have talked about technology to a newly graduating class, seemed off and was not meeting the moment, was not sort of self-aware of the stat that Ashley just shared on sentiment among young people. It seemed like anytime he mentioned AI, he just got booed even louder. Right.
Well, I have some nuanced takes. I mean, I absolutely agree that speech was like a huge flop. I listened to the whole thing. So first I saw the clips and I was like,
Yep. Yep.
"Oh, unforced error, terrible job, like whatever." And then I listened to the speech in its entirety, which like maybe that's problem number 1. No one listens to these things in their entirety anymore, right? We are in an era of clips.
We're in the clipping era. How many articles do we have to
The
read about clipping
clipping
right now? Oh my
yeah,
God.
the clipping
Yeah.
era, and the clips really made it seem like the crowd was, like, booing any mention of AI, but if you are, packing up your apartment and have a lot of
For a big
free
move.
time late at night, to listen to multiple commencement speeches in preparation for this podcast, and you listen to the whole thing, you will note that people were booing before he said a single word. So it was like from the beginning, they were booing. He started off talking about like the personal computer and like people were, it was not a like, oh, there was a mention of AI or his messaging didn't land. And not to say that it's not, the booing wasn't about AI, but I think this
Mhm.
speech does not live in a vacuum. And I actually think there was no way Eric Schmidt was going to be able to deliver a successful speech with this audience. And he did actually attempt to like meet people where they were. I don't think he did a very artful job of it, but he sort of acknowledged that like earlier eras of computing, they were so optimistic and they thought democratization access would only be good for people. And of course, reality was like much more nuanced and much like, much more challenging. And so like he really did try to like preface and sort of set the stage for a conversation around AI that wasn't just like AI hype, but like, hey, like we've learned in tech that like progress is hard and it impacts people in ways we can't imagine. And so, anyways, I think like the speech was actually architected for a critical audience, but it didn't matter. I saw some people like wordsmithing his messaging, and I'm like, like there was no way
Yeah.
this was going to land because like these students are online and they are seeing all the other headlines and all the other clips and all the other quotes about this like doomsday narrative and how there are going to be no more white collar jobs and no more entry level jobs and how data centers are
He's
going
like
to.
in many ways the face of it. He just becomes like as a tech
Yeah.
person, right?
Yeah,
Tech
totally.
person.
And he's also not like an inspiring, he's no Steve Jobs, who we will get to in a bit. And so he also just doesn't have that like natural charisma or like emotional connection with an audience. And so there was no way to craft this speech where he would have won over this audience. The other piece of nuance that I do want to flag is that like he got applause at the end, like more applause than booze, and that might just have been people like feeling bad for him because he literally did have to give a speech while people were booing the entire time, which I was like, I don't know if I could do that personally. And so, it's possible that 20% of the audience hated this. And then, like, 20% fucking loved it. And then the middle was just neutral and was like, let's hear this guy out. And it's like Twitter. It's like you don't know what the silent majority are thinking. And it wasn't a speech where there were opportunities to cheer or laugh.
Mm,
And so all you had were opportunities to hear booing. I will give one piece of messaging feedback, which is that like he was really trying to force feed the future to these students. And it was like, this is happening. This is going to happen everywhere. It's going to change everything. And then his like rallying cry was like, help shape it and be part of it and have agency. But I think it was too forceful and too like the train is already moving. He used his rocket ship quote again, which I was like,
I
oh God,
know. I know.
we can't do that again. But like he tried to apply it to AI, which is like AI is a rocket ship, like just get on. Don't
Yeah.
worry about your seat. And I feel like that's just a kind of a condescending message
Yeah.
to this like
That's
class of
right.
young people.
Yeah, I thought the commencement speaker pick was like knowing how fraught sort of the landscape is right now on data centers, right? On job insecurity and all that stuff. Picking a tech leader, he's I guess most tied to Google, and Google is definitely still in the AI race, right? It just felt like, oh, that was a choice. And so not sure how much she was even set up for success anyways, right? Like what prompted the students to go digging and find a lot of the civil lawsuit stuff, right? Is because they were probably already feeling like, ugh, like on the choice. And so that's on the school, in my opinion. But that's actually like a nice segue into a very different type of speech, which was Tom Brady's at Georgetown's business school. And I always think of sports as one of the few things we have left that really unites people across different sectors, social strata, right? Like all these, like we're really running out of the things that people can sort of find common ground in, and sports remain, kind of the one of the few, in my opinion. And so Tom Brady is also polarizing because they have like the Pats had the most like winningest record, and he's won like seven, I lost count, seven or eight Super Bowl rings and Super Bowl titles. And so a lot of people including me. Like if I were in the audience, I would be like eye roll to the end. But he gave a great speech. And so comparing that to Eric Schmidt, where you're coming in with a bias, like let's say you're not a Pats fan, you were not a big TB12
I
person.
couldn't I couldn't bring myself to watch him. So even though I went to Georgetown.
It was very short. It
Okay.
was
I saw
very
some
short.
clips and I was like, this sounds really cliche, but I maybe cliches work well.
Cliche, absolute. Was it cliche? Did he draw parallels for the entire speech to one game, right? And take you through the
Mm,
drama and the climax of the, quarter by quarter breakdown, the percentage chance that they would lose that game? Absolutely. So, yes, cliches everywhere. But I feel like he had all of the classic pieces of like a great speech, right? Like, and he really shared his own struggle and left the audience like inspired and feeling hopeful,
mhm.
because in the end, and you say this all the time, which is like successful people need to share their past
Yeah. It's the
struggle, and
most
that's exactly
generous
what
thing
he
you can
did.
do is to be
And
like,
that's
this is how hard
exactly
it
what he did.
was.
That's exactly what he did. And that was one where it was just set up better, because sports is
Yeah.
one of the least controversial things, and then something that unites people. And then, yeah, he's just sort of like nailed everything. And this is coming from a person who like does not enjoy him whatsoever. So I thought that was pretty good.
I mean, Steve Jobs is the
The canonical,
the
incredible,
classic. I
yes.
went back and like listened to the whole thing. And I think the thing, and it sounds like this is what Tom Brady did too, and what Eric failed to do at any point during his speech,
Mm,
was like Steve Jobs actually told stories, right? Like Eric seemed like he was kind of like half scolding, half motivated, like, just pitching an audience. And let's be real, he was barely thinking about the audience before him. He was thinking about this YouTube video that's going to go, of course, commencement speeches have taken on a bit of a new life in the internet age. But Steve Jobs stood up and told, the Stanford class of 2005 3 stories about his life, and they were all very vulnerable. The first was dropping out of
right.
college, which,
Yeah.
also provided a great opportunity for some jokes, given the occasion he was speaking at. He talked about being fired from Apple, and he talked about, getting his first cancer diagnosis. But it was beautiful because he, like, he talked about these, like, some of the lowest moments of his life or the most stressful moments of his life, and then he talked about, like, how they like, what he learned from them, and how they ended up sort of shaping his perspective, and in hindsight, being so powerful. And then he, like, pulled out some wisdom for the class. And, it's funny because I remember how, iconic this speech is, but when I listened to it, it was like, it was actually very simple, and the simplicity, I think, was part of its power. I mean, Steve Jobs is also an incredible communicator, an incredible orator, and so he really had that going for him. You try to think about, like, and I try to remember like what headspace you're in when you're graduating from college. And of course it changes by, what era we're in. And so 2005 maybe was like not the worst time. We weren't yet in the Great Depression or whatever.
Oh, I think it was a good time because enough time had passed since the dot-com crash.
The dot-com crash, and this is Stanford and, like, the heart of tech, and
Exactly, but it was sort of like the 2008 crash
was
too.
still far away. But people are like, everyone's a little nervous, right? Like, you're proud, you're nostalgic, you're, like, a little uncertain about the future. Maybe some people feel like they have their next thing lined up, maybe other people don't. And so, like, how do you meet that moment, and how do you meet that emotional state? And so I think Steve Jobs talking about these moments of, like, great uncertainty was beautiful. I mean, another way to do it is like humor. I watched the Conan O'Brien Dartmouth speech, and he was just so funny, and both so self-deprecating and also just like making fun of the students in the school in like the most like delightful way. And I was like, yeah, that is also a great, like, he didn't take himself too seriously. He didn't take the moment too seriously. Like, people are nervous, people are on this, like, this precipice of the next phase of their lives. And I was laughing so hard, and everyone in the audience was laughing so hard. I'm like, great, that is also another, like, I feel like Steve Jobs and Conan O'Brien are like two different ways you could approach this moment that both like really, really land. And then, yeah, what you don't want to do is be Eric Schmidt, like campaigning for AI and like have high agency joy. Like it was like he was talking to tech Twitter. I'm like, nobody, like that's not
Right.
gonna work here.
Well, I was thinking about the general commentary around how like it seems like the speeches all sucked this year is actually a comment that I read over and over again.
Yeah.
And actually asked some younger people who like, still have siblings and who graduated and maybe attended. I was like, what did you think of the commencement speech? Did you and they were just like, yeah, it was just a crappy year for commencement speeches. And I was like,
Yeah.
that's an interesting comment because everything's going up and to the right, right? Like AI has disrupted writing. There are so many writing tools, and the speeches are not getting better. So that was like my first
Yeah.
kind of like, oh, how is tech not making this better, right? Like, why isn't tech supposed
Oh
to
my
make
gosh.
everything
Helen,
better?
you only have to go on LinkedIn to see that AI does not make writing better.
100%.
um,
And then,
we are
yes, but
not
the other
there.
thing, that's right. But the other thing was sort of like, I think that culturally we have a very complex relationship with writing and knowing how to value it. And that sort of, is a kind of a capitalist framework, right? So, like, I'll say, even within marketing, when people ask me, like, oh, what's the average salary for like this person, this marketing role on the team, or a founder's like, oh, founding market, and I'm always like, well, it kind of depends. Do they skew right brain, left brain? Are they more of a growth marketer or a product marketer, or are they more a content
Yeah.
marketer, right? And the salaries, the range is extremely wide. So basically, I'm saying that like writers, right, people who are classically trained writers, like went to the top journalism schools, like have graduate degrees, they've been making some of the lowest salaries even within a lot of
Yeah.
these like tech organizations, because we just don't know how to value writing. And then of course now with all these AI tools we value it even less because it's like we'll just generate that, right? We'll just give it some prompts and it'll shoot out like this beautiful blog post. And so it was like, on the one hand, I'm holding that, and then I'm hearing these speeches suck, and I'm like, oh, that was like first thought. The second was, I also feel like when we were kind of growing up in tech, it was sort of like the speech era. Like TED was really big. It was totally normal to just be like listening to a couple
Yeah.
of TED Talks on your like
Even
commute to
even
work.
TEDx, it's like
Yes,
embarrassing cousin. Like people were
totally.
like,
We were exposed to that a little bit more. And then me personally, like The West Wing was like my favorite show of all time. And like all of the characters that I loved most were like the writers, right? So like the Sam Seaborn, Toby Ziegler, like the speechwriters, the people behind the scenes. And that very much shaped kind of like where I went with my career. But now, how many like glorified writing roles are there?
yeah.
Right? Like it's funny, like so much of the Obama speechwriters, like ugh, those guys, I
They're
can't.
now podcasters.
Yeah, yeah, but like they'll admit that those were the glory days, right? So in contrast,
Yeah.
it's like we're not in the glory days right now, and so everyone has their own theories as to why like we're less equipped to create these incredible speeches. But that was just something that I was thinking about.
I really do think our brains have been rewired to like, what's the sound bite? What's the clip? What's the short thing? Or we're going to have a 4 hour long podcast interview discussion. And like the art of giving a speech that like builds over time on itself has been lost to your point, and or is undervalued. And I do think that's sad. The only example I could think of where it feels like this art form is still at its peak are like hour-long comedy specials, where you like you listen
Mm.
to someone tell stories for an hour, and maybe we need those people to be giving more commencement addresses because they know how to construct that narrative and bring people along for that journey. My thought experiment with this was like, who could I mean, first of all, Helen, I totally agree. Like I'm hopeful that there will be, I don't know if everyone's graduated yet, and maybe there will be some like kind of unknown person who gave the killer speech of 2026, and that will like
Mm.
make its way into our feeds because it actually does feel like we need a good message for young people now more than ever. I feel like the rhetoric is bad, and I feel like people who are graduating in this class like deserve a little bit of inspiration, deserve to have someone who like understands where they are and how they're feeling. My thought experiment, which is of course very much through like a tech lens, but I was like, who could have actually given a good AI speech? Like, and where I landed was like literally no one in tech. no one in tech
Yes,
could have
exactly.
delivered.
Because people are so cynical and they're going to be like, you benefit from this. Of course you
Yeah,
would
you're
say
the
this, right?
architect of this. Of course,
Exactly,
you want us
exactly.
to be, your little AI human agents going out.
Right.
But I do think someone who is like, in a field that is being potentially disrupted by AI and is like grappling with it and has a perspective and a message around why like human creativity, like a pro-human message of like, here's how I think we navigate this.
Yeah, I almost feel like having a good speech is like the antidote to the like AI everywhere, AI slop thing. And I'm just a little sad that nothing really delivered on that.
Helen, should we write a speech and the next pod is like
Another thought
us
that I had was just sort of
giving a
like
commencement address?
maybe that we have shifted the definition of being like a public speaker to tweeting all the time. And
Yeah.
they are so different, right? Or like going on podcasts. Going on podcasts is so much easier than giving a
Yeah, having a
speech.
conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think tweeting similarly is so much easier than giving a speech. And so I feel like we at the same time feel like people are everywhere and visible and there's lots of messages, but also are left sort of feeling like, oh, but these little bite-sized 30-minute sort of inspirational talks like are kind of like missing in our lives. Thank you for listening to Great Chat. Have questions for us? Make sure to submit them at anothergreatchat.com. See you next week.